Okay. 1, can it really fix a broken heart? So my topic is resveratrol, which has been known to be found in red wine, most predominantly in the media, and it's been discussed its effects on cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease, what is it? It's an inflammatory disease involving the heart's arteries and veins, and there's several diseases that are actually associated under the umbrella of cardiovascular disease, such as heart disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, coronary artery disease, coronary heart disease, and ischemic heart disease. So those are all used interchangeably under cardiovascular disease. Some risk factors are degenerative diseases like diabetes, smoking, or just being inactive. For example, for a diet, if you have a diet high in saturated fat, that's going to leave a lot of excess LDL in your blood and low HDL levels. And what that causes is a fat buildup in your arteries and veins, which later leads to plaque buildup or atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries, which could lead to a heart attack or hypertension because it allows just a small space for the blood to get through. And then just to go off that, diabetes actually causes endothelial cell injury, which are the cells that line your blood vessels. So if there's injury to that, obviously that's going to cause heart problems as well. As for rates of mortality, it's the leading cause of death in the U.S. and most industrialized countries. For example, coronary heart disease kills 1 in 4 people each year, which is equal to 600,000 people. This can be attributed to increase in portion sizes over the years, bigger portions, more fat, more bang for your buck, like in McDonald's or Burger King. These large portions aren't really doing anything except for harming the people that are consuming them. So resveratrol, as I mentioned before, it's an antioxidant polyphenol found in wine, predominantly red wine. It's also found in grape seeds and other berries, as stated. And then what does it do? It's an anti-inflammation, anti-cancer, antioxidant with cardiovascular benefits. It increases HDL levels, improves dilation of veins and arteries, decreases atherosclerosis, which I mentioned earlier, is the hardening of the arteries and veins and things like that can really be detrimental to your heart. So what it does is kind of alleviates that. It vasodilates them or makes them larger, which increases blood flow, thus potentially decreasing cardiovascular disease or other heart complications. Another thing that's associated with resveratrol is the French paradox, which alludes that people with a high fat diet, mostly saturated fat, like in most European countries such as France, combined with daily wine consumption, actually have lower mortality rates than people who don't consume wine daily. So that's a study that I will talk about later, and it's just something interesting. And in addition, resveratrol increases nitric oxide on the endothelial cell level. So, as stated earlier, the endothelial cell lines the blood vessels and lining of the heart's arteries and veins. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, which I also mentioned earlier, opens up the veins, increases blood flow, thus decreasing risk for any cardiovascular complications. It also regulates blood flow and maintains vascular homeostasis or homeostasis of the heart. Yeah. Okay, this isn't changing. Okay. Okay. Nope, that's skipped one. Okay, so as stated earlier, diabetes is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And there's been several studies done seeing the effects of resveratrol on people with diabetes. So just to give a little overview, diabetes is a degenerative and inflammatory disease. As stated before, it causes endothelial cell injury, which are, again, cells that line the blood vessel leading to the heart. With diabetes, there's impaired nitric oxide production, which, again, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. And diabetes, like I just said, is a CVD risk factor. Also associated with diabetes is predominantly people who are overweight or are inactive, and those people in general are more predisposed to cardiovascular disease. Also, diabetes reduces nitric oxide production, which increases production of reactive oxygen species in the vessel wall. Reactive oxygen species, as the name states, are very reactive. They have an unpaired electron and cause degeneration and cell proliferation in the arteries. So, as stated, studies have been done to assess the impairment of nitric oxide, mediated vasodilation, and the effects of resveratrol in diabetics. Also, endothelial cell injury from diabetes is due to, or can be attributed to, oxidative stress, and that in turn causes inflammation, which is also a cardiovascular disease risk. So, as stated before, there's been studies on the effects of resveratrol on diabetes. So this one study in particular, resveratrol protects vascular smooth muscle cells against high glucose-induced oxidative stress and cell proliferation in vitro. So the study assesses sirtuin-1 in vascular smooth muscle and atherosclerosis. So sirtuin-1 is an enzyme created actually by resveratrol, or it's activated by resveratrol. And that is said to protect vascular smooth muscle against cell proliferation and high glucose-induced oxidative stress, as seen in diabetics. So the study assessed the effects of resveratrol on a cellular level and really looked at cell proliferation and cell oxidation at cells that were exposed to resveratrol versus cells that were not exposed to resveratrol. They also looked at reactive oxygen species and other biomarkers of oxidative stress. So as stated earlier, reactive oxygen species, as stated in the name, they're very reactive to other molecules and cause oxidative stress on the vascular muscles and can also cause cancer, heart disease, and brain complications. So like I just said, they treated cells with and without resveratrol solution. And so there was an increase in cell number with resveratrol-treated cells. They thus concluded sirtuin-1, which is activated by resveratrol, is very therapeutic in the prevention of diabetes and atherosclerosis, so in turn prevents cardiovascular disease risk. So thus attenuating risk of CVD and atherosclerosis development. Another degenerative disease state, I guess you could call it, and risk factor for cardiovascular disease is smoking. So smoking puts your body in an inflammatory state. It actually increases your CRP, which is your C-reactive protein. And in lab values, CRP is a marker to assess inflammation. CVD risk factor. And as with diabetes, there has been several studies done to assess the effects of resveratrol on smokers. So this one study, anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects of resveratrol in healthy smokers, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial. They assessed the effects of resveratrol on inflammation and oxidative stress in healthy smokers. So what they did was they measured 50 healthy adult smokers and assessed them over a 90-day period. They had a resveratrol group and a placebo group. And in the resveratrol group, they gave them 500 milligrams of resveratrol in a supplement form over a 30-day period. And then they had a 30-day washout period where they just went on their normal diet again. And then they went back to a 30-day placebo. And then the other group that had the placebo first is just the opposite, and they concluded with a 500 milligram dose of resveratrol through alcohol consumption each day. So what they found was the CRP levels were lowered by 50% in both groups. So it just showed over a month's period of time, CRP can be lowered with doses of 500 milligrams of resveratrol. They also assessed other, they also looked at other studies that gave a much lower dose of resveratrol. For example, another study tested only 8 milligrams of resveratrol for a year-long period and only decreased CRP levels 26%, whereas in this study, CRP levels decreased by 50% in 1 month of resveratrol supplementation, which also leads to another thing that I found while researching this topic, is that resveratrol could be dose dependent. Other studies showed the amount of resveratrol in red wine versus white wine, how that could have a potential impact, and as stated widely in the media, that it's predominantly red wine that has the most benefits because it is the highest in resveratrol. And yeah, out of all the I'll get to that point in a second, actually. Okay. Time that. Okay, and then to conclude, like I stated, a glass, not a gallon. It could be dose dependent. Excess alcohol actually increases your risk of high blood pressure, high triglycerides, liver damage, obesity, certain types of cancer, accidents, and other problems. In addition, too much alcohol can weaken your heart muscles, and cause cardiomyopathy, which is exactly what I just stated, weaken heart muscles. And it can also cause liver damage, cirrhosis, things like that, and can contribute to obesity, as stated before, which, going back to the beginning, is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So how they did find the moderate wine consumption leads to a decrease in vascular inflammation, and they found that because resveratrol can inhibit oxidative stress, as seen in diabetics and smokers, as well as vascular smooth muscles from being destroyed by reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. So it does that by enhancing nitric oxide production or endothelial nitric oxide synthetase, which produces nitric oxide. So the amount of resveratrol in wine can increase that and thus decrease inflammation by vasodilating the arteries, endothelial cells, and just really create efficient blood flow to all the heart's arteries and veins, as well as the rest of the body and vasculature. They also looked at various alcoholic beverages in several studies to see if it's the alcohol portion or the antioxidant portion of the alcohol, which is in wine's case the resveratrol, that leads to various mortality rates and risk of cardiovascular disease. So they found that it is in fact the resveratrol or antioxidant portion rather than the ethanol portion that increases vasodilation. So sorry, beer drinkers, it's really in the red wine that decreases your risk for overall CVD mortality risk. The studies also assessed the same amount of alcoholic beverage over a year's period, and what they found was that all the different types of alcohol, from spirits, beers, wines, all various types, that they did all vasodilate the veins in a short period of time. However, the only one that decreased cardiovascular disease mortality risk was red wine. So, yeah, drink up that red wine.